Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes,
yes,
I can hear you.
Okay, we're ready to go? Okay, all good. Good morning, good afternoon and good evening, everybody. My name is John Mason, and this year I'm serving as a co-chair for the International Program Committee for ICCE 2020. Prior to the outbreak of COVID this year, I was also getting organised to be welcoming you all to Darwin in Australia, but perhaps, hopefully, we're going to do that another time in another couple of years. It's also this morning my great honour to be able to introduce to you Peter Goodyear. So Peter is a Professor of Education at the University of Sydney. He's also an Australian Learning and Teaching Fellow and an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow. He was the founding co-director of Sydney's Centre for Research on Learning and Innovation, CRLI. Peter's research focuses on methods for the analysis and design of complex learning environments, professional education, and the nature of professional knowledge. He's published 13 books and 145 journal articles and book chapters. His latest books include The Education Ecology of Universities, Integrating Learning, Strategy and the Academy, published in 2019 by Routledge, and Spaces of Teaching and Learning, published by Springer in 2018, both with Rob Ellis. Also in 2017, Epistemic Fluency and Professional Education with Lena Markowskate, if I pronounced that properly, Peter, and Place-Based Spaces for Networked Learning with Lucila Carvalho and Martin Delart. Before moving to Sydney in 2003, Peter worked at Lancaster University in the UK. As he's going to explain in his talk, there's some background to his interest in the field of computers and education when he began programming computers way back in 1973. So Peter, Peter's talk today is Computers and Education Reflections on Learning, Technology and Design. Peter, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, John. And I've got just a couple of quick points to make before we get into the talk itself. One of those is to say that I've cut out a few things that I was going to talk about during the session, but they're still there in the slide deck. I've put a link to the slide deck. You can download it if you want from my website. So if you look in the chat, you'll see a link there. I'm mentioning this particularly because there are some follow-up readings and other links in there that you might find useful, and that's where they are. Also, if we run tight for time, I will be looking through the chat to see what questions get raised. So ask away whenever anything occurs to you, and I'll undertake one way or another to reply to all the questions. It may be offline after the session goes, but one way or another, I'd like to be able to respond to your questions and feedback. So I think without further ado, let's get into the talk. So Alex, are you going to wish your name?
I think Alex is just going to load that, yep.
Yep. Well, it's lovely to be here, and thank you everybody for coming along to this session. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I work, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. This is their land, always was and always will be. I'd like to thank the organising committee of the 28th International Conference on Computers in Education for inviting me to give this keynote. So, 40 years ago, this month, I found myself starting a new job at the University of Aston in Birmingham in a department of educational research. And it turned out to be a terrific opportunity, unlooked for opportunity for me to move into what was then a new field of research. And I began teaching, but also doing some initial studies and beginning to write a few articles and book chapters about what people were doing with computers in education and what I might do. And it feels to me incredible, really, that this is 40 years ago, but photographic evidence cannot be denied. Here I am, unbelievably old on the right, and there I am, unbelievably young on the left. And the picture on the left reminds me that my involvement with computer technology goes back even more than 40 years. It's actually, I think, 1973 that I first learnt any kind of computer programming. Those were my textbooks on Algol 60. I was taught by a professor of mathematics who had learned his own computing skills while he worked at the University of Liverpool in England. He was the founding director of the Liverpool Computer Laboratory. And he was using, when he got started, he was using computers of a kind designed and built by Alan Turing and his colleagues nearby at the University of Manchester. So when I look at the young me on the left there, I think of somebody being taught by someone who was in close touch with Turing and the initial days of computing, the initial days of the digital age. And a computer at the top, Research Machines 380Z, I've put that there because it played an extraordinary role in the lives of those of us who were working in computing in schools in Britain, late 1970s, early 1980s. It was one of the two workhorses of educational computing at that time. And it's the machine on which I did my own first programming for educational computing purposes, and on which I wrote my first book, a book on Logo, the programming language Logo. And so after Aston, I moved to Avery Hill College in South East London, and by around 1982, I found myself doing quite a lot of work with primary school teachers from the southern and eastern part of London. And you could think of these primary school teachers as early adopters. They were keen teachers, enthusiastic about innovation, not necessarily techie. Many of them taught in inner city schools, but for one reason or another, they'd heard something about the possibilities of working with computers in primary schools. Perhaps their head teacher had arranged to buy a computer for the school, and they'd been sent to work with me on a professional development course in which we jointly explored what it might be possible to do and what might be worth doing with these new computers in primary school settings. Now, important to point out, I think, that I'd got no specialist educational knowledge. It wasn't my background at all. My undergraduate degree and postgraduate PhD were in geography. And I guess while studying geography, that had given me the opportunity to learn statistics and learn computer programming, data analysis, given me some generic skills that I could use to get employment later on. So I guess I was in a position where I knew more about computing than the teachers from the primary schools, but very little about what they were doing. between us, we haven't got a great deal of organised pedagogical knowledge in the sense of learning theory or the kinds of principled knowledge base that one comes to think about these days. They'd probably encountered a bit of Piaget in their initial education, and I'd recently read Seymour Pappert's Mindstorms book, and I'd begun to get enthusiastic about Logo without actually having a computer that could run it. We might come back to that later on. But the way we operated, these 20 or so primary school teachers and myself over a semester, was to sit around in small groups, and I would demo one of the software programs that was available for the Research Machines computer, and they would have a think about what kinds of things they could imagine doing with that program back in their primary classrooms. And they'd discuss and think about additional resources that they might need in order to make a success of what that activity might be. And I mention this because this, as one of my first serious engagements with other teachers, looking at how good use might be made of digital computers, I think for me this was one of the most rewarding of many educational endeavours that I've been engaged in. It was very much a process of collaborative sense-making. I guess these days we might talk about co-design. It certainly wasn't a situation in which I could explain to them what they should be doing with computers, and they needed from me a certain amount of knowledge about technical matters and a few associated matters. But the rest of this was really a process in which good educational activities or possibilities for good educational activities emerged from some fusion of grounded experience and the discussion with peers in the moment. So I want to use this time jump, if you like, of 40 years to make a couple of contrasts over learning and technology and the ideas that were circling in our heads or in our work. The point here really is to draw out a few threads, a few ideas to explore with respect to learning and technology before I get on to the main topic of the talk, which is design. And I'm not aiming here to make a sharp contrast or any kind of controlled comparison between how we were thinking about learning and technology in 1980 and how we think about it today. I think it's almost impossible to do that. And certainly some of what's changed from my perspective has been to do with a shift from working in primary schools to working with university students and teachers, but also I think shifting from a focus on computers and education in school classroom contexts where the teacher can keep quite a close eye on what's occurring, to learning situations that are characterised by groups of students working together without much close supervision. But I'll come back to that shortly. So here, when I think about working with the primary school teachers back in 1982 or thereabouts, one of the things we talked about a lot were ULPs, useful little programs. And these were little because that's all you could run on a machine that was as limited as a 380Z, and useful because they had multiple purposes, if you like. They were often referred to as open-ended software, insofar as they didn't teach anything specifically, but could be used for a variety of different purposes. So one of the ways that learning cropped up in our discussions was in terms of what it might be worthwhile doing with these ULPs. Now, critics at the time often said things like, well, this looks like solutions in search of a problem. You've got this computer and now you're trying to work out what to do with it. And I think it's a fair enough criticism in a way, but I also think it's an important aspect of how the field of computers in education has evolved over the years, and that time and time again we've had some new gadget, some new technological artifact, some new set of possibilities that people then explore the educational potentials and possibilities of, and that has been an important part of the dynamic within computing and education. Now, part of how learning was framed in these discussions, these sessions we had in the Continuing Professional Development Programme, part of that depended upon the primary school teachers themselves being confident in their abilities to improvise worthwhile activity with their students at learn time, that they were thinking of ways to start off productive learning activities using one of these useful little programs, knowing that they would be able to improvise various kinds of follow-on activity or take the discussion with kids in the classroom in useful directions. And also the understanding of learning that the teachers had, the teachers who were participating in this process, was one that was very deeply grounded. It was what we might think of as a deep and local sense of what works, explicable in terms of a folk psychology of learning, using constructs, everyday constructs, about learning and teaching. But also, and I think this is fundamentally important, also grounded in a very robust primary curriculum, which itself reflected some core beliefs about constructivism, about child-centred education, and so on and so forth. So a lot of this emanating from the Plaid report in the mid to late 60s, which had a very powerful effect on how people thought about good education at primary level. So what I'm saying here is that there were ideas about learning that did productive work in our discussions, but those ideas about learning came from a variety of sources, deeply grounded, scaffolded, one might say, in the everyday experiences of these primary school teachers. Looking at the work that I've been doing with my team in the last few years, I'd say that our sense of what learning is has changed. Our sense of what human capabilities consist of and look like has changed. And not unnaturally, the circumstances in which we're observing and encouraging learning have changed quite a bit. I'll come back to those ideas about technological change shortly, but in many of our studies in the team at Sydney, you could say what we've been trying to do is work with others to come to a better understanding of how to design and improve complex digital material learning spaces, and how we're thinking about learning in those spaces has at least this complexity to it. So for sure there are discipline or profession-specific concepts and skills to be learnt. The generic skills and dispositions that we want our students to acquire in some sense. There's also this more complex notion of what it is to be learned and skillful in a field of practice, whether academic practice, professional practice, or whatever, encapsulated as this notion of learning to harmonise multiple forms of knowledge and ways of knowing as a situation demands. And beyond that, we're looking for students to learn how to engage in inquiry, but also to design new forms of inquiry, and to learn to create and customise their own epistemic environments. And some of this work is captured particularly in the later chapters of the book that I did with Lina Markowskite on epistemic fluency and professional education. So if you want to pursue some of these ideas a bit further, the last couple of chapters of that book should be helpful. So thinking about the technology itself, in relative terms, computers in the late 70s, early 80s were expensive, so they were scarce. It was not unusual to have just one in a primary school or half a dozen in a high school. And when teachers couldn't come to the college to learn about using computers in the classroom, quite often I would go to them. I would pack up a research machine 380Z, its monitor, its keyboard, a printer, an acoustic coupler and various other bits and pieces, put them in my old Citroen Diane, take them round to one or other of the local primary schools, and would almost always find that the room I'd been given to do a demonstration in would be on the top floor of the school. So you soon learned that these were heavy pieces of equipment, much less mobile than the children, but nevertheless I ended up carrying the computer to the kids rather than the kids coming to the computer. And it took a while to set them up. You could be 5, 10, 15 minutes from arrival to having a computer system running one of those useful little programs. So it could be quite hard to adapt to changing conditions in the classroom, and one didn't switch rapidly from one activity to a computer-based activity. There was always an overhead of getting things organised. And I've put this term imported there because quite a lot of the research that was being done at the time and for some years afterwards depended very much on research teams getting the funding to buy equipment that could be brought into schools for the duration of some study. And quite commonly, at the end of the research period, the equipment was taken away again. It's just part of the deal, part of the way that research would be funded. But could be regarded as doing severe damage to the learning ecology of the classroom, except rarely did we think of things in that way at the time. And thinking about technology now as it's manifest in our work, no longer do we think of computers as being scarce and not wanting to ignore problems of the digital divide, etc. One might say that in a lot of the work we do in universities, particularly, digital technology is all but ubiquitous. Rather than standalone, highly networked, lots of devices that are interdependent, woven into everyday practices, and often taken for granted. Where it was once imported specially into an environment to teach or to do some research, it's now characteristically mobile, or many devices characteristically mobile, personally owned. And when one thinks about technology in situ, one thinks about the hybrid, about heterogeneity, about the multiple rather than the singular. And I think we can see some consequences for the ways that we have framed research, development, evaluation, design over time, looking back through the literature, looking back through my own personal experience, that in those early days, the canonical form of research would have been around one-to-one interactions, one child, one computer, or perhaps a computer in a small group. And very often we'd have done that work in either a research lab in our home institution or in a lab-like setting in some corner of a classroom in a school. And that seemed an appropriate thing to do because the focus was very tightly upon these local interactions, one computer and a couple of kids maybe, and what we might think of as being context was kind of wished away by this framing. And these days, where we could much more commonly or readily refer to computers in use in education as being characterized by it's really a complex, dynamic ecology of networked, personal, organizationally provided devices and spaces and so on. Given that reality of use, then to understand what happens in those situations, in situ studies, field studies, feel absolutely essential. So if I think about those primary school teachers back in the early 80s, or if I think of the university teachers I've been working with over the last few years, one of the things that strikes me is that they quite often end up doing things which are enormously innovative, which involve tackling really complicated design problems and coming up with solutions for how to make good use of digital technology that I think run way ahead of what we could deduce from design principles, from learning theory and so on and so forth. But one of the things they're able to do is use both their own local knowledge, whether that's local disciplinary knowledge or local knowledge from learning spaces, to combine that with the constraints of the situations in which they're working to come up with solutions to very, very complicated design problems. And one way of talking about that is to say that innovative practice often runs ahead of normative theory, that people end up doing in practice things that look impossible from a theoretical point of view. And if that is the case, then it seems to me our field of computers and education, the learning sciences, can learn quite a lot by observing closely those innovative practices and trying to abstract some key principles or key features from what's going on. And one of the approaches I've taken to doing this is to draw on practice theory as advanced by folks like Theodore Shadsky, Stephen Kemmis, David Nicolini, Elizabeth Shove and others, to make sense of what it is that teachers and teacher designers are doing on the ground, the patterns of doing, sayings and relatings within specific projects for co-designing new educational activities. And there's an example of the kinds of insights that one can draw from this in a paper I did that BJET published earlier this year. As a reference to it at the bottom there. In the second half of the talk, I want to shift the focus to design. I want to look more closely at design for learning, its constituent practices, the kinds of knowledge on which it draws, and the forms of inquiry that generate that knowledge. The background for this, in terms of my own personal research and experience, comes from trying to understand complex, hybrid digital material learning environments in order to come up with ways of enhancing them, making them more educationally effective. And in doing this, I'll point out that there are some silences in the design-based research literature about this area that I think merit some attention. I think those silences emerge from a double meaning of the word design, that it can be used either as a noun or as a verb. And in the DBR literature, I might claim that design usually features as a noun, that is, DBR starts with an artifact of some kind that's been produced through some sort of design process. It might be an instructional plan or an educational resource or an app. But what the DBR literature is almost entirely silent about, at least the areas that I know of it, relates to design as a verb, the processes and practices of design, the things that happen in order to produce those artifacts or to understand and improve those learning environments. And that's really what I'm going to be focusing in on, that skilled collaborative practice within which inquiry and the formulation of candidate solutions are worked out. This image comes from Nigel Cross's work, his book Designly Ways of Knowing. And he talks about understanding design in terms of these three areas: design praxeology, which is the study of the practices and processes of design; design epistemology, the study of designly ways of knowing; and design phenomenology, the study of the products of the design process. Yanis Dimitriadis and I picked up on Nigel Cross's work and reworked it in the context of design for learning in a paper in Research in Learning Technology a few years ago. And one of the points that we make is that DBR, for the most part, is just interested in design phenomenology, the study of the products of the design process and their lives, life cycles and outcomes in educational contexts, with a primary purpose of contributing to theoretical accounts of learning. Almost every paper that you read in the DBR literature points out how important it is to contribute back into theory, as well, of course, one hopes, to improve local educational practice and outcomes. Now, why are we interested in learning environments, and what do they have to do with design? Well, I've got two quotes here, one of which I use rather a lot, John Dewey. "We never educate directly but indirectly by means of the environment. Whether we permit chance environments to do the work or whether we design environments for the purpose makes a great difference." Now, in Democracy and Education, the book that this quotation comes from, Dewey clearly means something more by environment than we often mean in the EdTech area, but nevertheless I want to use this quote to draw out the main point, to do with design of environments rather than chance environments and the consequences for learning. And I want to couple that with this quote from Nelson and Stolterman's wonderful book, The Design Way, where they say that human intention, made visible and concrete through the instrumentality of design, enables us to create conditions, systems and artifacts that facilitate the unfolding of human potential through designed evolution, in contrast to an evolution based on chance and necessity, a highly unpredictable process. So what we've got here is a way of arguing for the importance of a designally approach to the environments within which learning and thinking unfold. I think about these things in the following way, and I'll talk through in roughly this order. That if we're interested in learning to shape environments that are conducive to learning and thinking, then amongst the things that we need to do, I argue, is to undertake research guided by the pragmatics of use, that is, to understand what counts as actionable knowledge for the end users of our research, designers and teachers. I'll spell that out in a moment. Coupled with this is a need to understand how specific learning places function. And I've put in a whole set of quasi-synonyms for learning places, learning spaces here: networks, environments, systems, ecosystems, classrooms and ecologies. And a point I want to make in doing this is to say that we don't have a good shared term of art for the core phenomena that we need to explain when we're taking, let's say, an ecological approach to understanding learning environments. I want to say more about work we've done at Sydney on activity-centred analysis and design as just one approach to understanding complex learning spaces, learning networks. And that leads us on to thinking about educational ecology as an applied science, as a way of framing some of the issues to do with understanding complex learning situations and creating actionable knowledge for those who design, manage, improve and inhabit complex learning environments. Now, this approach of pragmatically guided research or design inquiry can be understood in the following terms, and I'm going to read this out just to emphasise the key points in it. So I want to claim that much of the research on learning that's undertaken within educational psychology, and I think also within learning sciences more broadly, aims to explain human cognitive mechanisms and other aspects of human learning without regard to the path to application of the resulting knowledge. And to be clear, I don't see that as a problem for curiosity-led research. but it does create problems. It creates a vacuum, if you like, with respect to the work involved in translating research-based principles into guidelines for application. So one might think about reversing this. A reverse strategy might parallel some research approaches that we find in design and engineering, which forge paths backwards, guided by a sense of what needs to be created, its structure, its components, and so on. And that gives you a direction back into research to frame appropriate questions and the sourcing of useful knowledge. So one might say the architecture of a class of object, system, machine, and so on, the thing being designed provides researchers with clear signals about the kinds of evidence that will be valuable, the scope, constraints on reliability of findings, and so on. I've created this diagram to represent the threefold nature of design inquiry according to Nelson and Stolterman. If we think about design inquiry as being the set of practices that produces knowledge that's useful for design, then Nelson and Stolterman encourage us to think about three kinds of inquiry, or maybe three areas of inquiry, or foci for inquiry. And this is inquiry into what's true, inquiry into what's real, and inquiry into what's ideal. Inquiry into what's ideal covers uncertainties about what is good, what is better, what will be good for learning, what a better learning outcome would look like, what a more satisfactory educational environment would look like. These are taken to be matters that are not necessarily self-evident, but that in particular situations may need systematic approaches to arrive at a better shared understanding of what's of value, what's desirable. Inquiry into what's true is familiar from standard accounts of science, and I think is familiar enough from work in the learning sciences and learning technology more generally. This is the space in which we hope to encounter universal truths or statements, propositions that might be held to be true about learning and other key phenomena, regardless of circumstances. But then there's inquiry into the real, and this means inquiry into the particular rather than the universal. It's inquiry into a singular learning situation, a particular learning environment, a course, a classroom, whatever it might be. And it's inquiry that's needed in order to establish how what we're observing in an educational context actually functions. And again, I'd claim this is a neglected aspect of writing about inquiry, design, and learning. So if we're thinking about how a particular learning environment or learning system actually functions, then we need to consider what counts as a good explanation, what counts as useful knowledge. And that brings us to thinking about causal mechanisms. What are the processes through which the systems we're looking at achieve their ends? How do they work, in other words? David Hammer and colleagues have drawn on the field of ecology for some insights here, and I think this is a useful way of framing it, but it's a mistake to presume that general laws are the only form of useful knowledge. That ecology has been advancing significantly through the development of local causal mechanisms and approaches to testing for their occurrence in specific systems. And again, from Andy Clark, a basic principle to observe in the quest for causal mechanisms is that explanatory priority turns not on what factor, if any, does the greatest amount of actual work. That is, we're not looking at what variable has the strongest correlation with some outcome measure, but we should be looking at what makes a difference between the cases where the outcome obtains and those where it does not. So we've got two examples here of ways of framing explanation that are specific to individual contexts or particular systems and environments. Something I wrote recently with Rob Ellis and Alexei Marmot might help draw together some of these threads. It runs as follows. The claim I want to make here is that in some of our research work, at least, we need to be both more ambitious and more modest. We need to rise to the challenge of understanding learning writ large, but we need to do this with the modesty of analytic researchers, trying to understand how some complex existing arrangements actually work, without prematurely imposing constraints based on what we think we will be able to change, and also without thinking too narrowly about how our investigation will turn into a good journal article. In other words, this is saying we need to think hard about what doing good science looks like in our field of inquiry. I now want to talk a little bit about an approach that we've taken, myself and colleagues at the University of Sydney, that is concerned with design inquiry and design methodology and design tools, and it runs under the title of Activity-Centered Analysis and Design. We can define ACAD as a meta-theoretical framework for understanding and improving local complex learning situations. And what I mean by that can be broken down as follows. It focuses on activity, what students are actually doing mentally, physically, emotionally, during a period of time when they're meant to be learning something. We could call it a learning episode or at learn time. And it talks about learning situations to underscore the point that students' learning activity is always situated in at least three ways: physically, that is digitally and materially, socially and epistemically. The focus is on the local because educational work is also situated. It's done by real teachers in concrete situations, with or without help from educational designers and evaluators. And complex is there in the definition of ACAD because teachers simply don't need an analysis and design methodology to diagnose simple problems or prescribe simple remedies. And it's meta-theoretical in that ACAD doesn't insist on any one theory of learning or any one theory for explaining connections between activity and the situations in which it unfolds. Now, in a moment, I'm going to switch to a short 3-minute video created by some colleagues of ours in the Sydney Business School and at the Copenhagen School of Business. It explains ACAD in a little bit more detail. And I find when I'm talking about ACAD that it's easiest for people who are hearing about it for the first time to get what it is if they imagine situations in which students are involved in what we might call active learning or learning by doing, collaborating in groups to get on with some project or task, and where teacher's supervision is light or absent, where the design of the task and suggestions about appropriate tools to use and ways of working with others, they have to be sufficient because teacher presence won't be enough to bring activities back on track if they stray off in unanticipated directions.
The Activity-Centered Analysis and Design framework, developed by GOODYEAR and Cavallo, is intended to support both the analysis and design of complex learning environments. The first important thing to point out is that the framework places activity at its core. It's activity-centred. This is because learning is about what people do. GOODYEAR and Cavallo state that this doing might involve thinking, feeling, perceiving, talking, making, moving, and so on. While we are not in full control over emergent activity, we can set up conditions that are likely to lead to the kinds of activity we value and to our intended learning outcomes. There are 3 key dimensions to the framework that are open to alteration through design: set design, epistemic design, and social design. In other words, as learning designers and teachers, these are the dimensions we can influence. Let's have a look at what each involves. Learning is physically situated. This is the case whether we are learning in a classroom, in a company, or online. Set design refers to how we arrange the physical or virtual learning environment. and any artefacts, tools and resources we introduce to support learning. All of these things physically situate learning activity. Learning is also epistemically situated. Epistemic design involves proposing tasks. Simply put, it's about making suggestions about good things for students to do. Finally, learning is socially situated. Social design is how we propose how people work together. For example, do we want students to work alone or to form dyads, groups or teams? What roles do we want them to play? And how might we divide the work between them? The final structural dimension of the framework, activity, is characterised as emergent. It is not open to alteration through design. As active learners exercise some autonomy in deciding what to do and how to do it, this dimension deals with acts of co-creation and co-configuration. Emergent activity is what happens at the time of learning, when tools, tasks and people come together in support of learning. The learning outcomes are tied to the activity that emerges. Notice that there is no mechanism linking proposed tasks directly to learning outcomes. The relationship is mediated by emergent activity. So how can we use the framework to support the design of complex learning environments? You could start by thinking about what productive learning activity would look like in relation to your intended learning outcome. What do you want students to be doing? Then you can ask what tasks are likely to generate that kind of activity. What environment and tools will best support students with this task? And what social configuration is likely to further facilitate students' learning? In other words, focus on achieving a strong alignment between the various dimensions. The stronger the alignment, the more likely it is that the emergent activity will be productive and lead to your intended learning outcomes.
Some of the recent work that we've been doing with ACAD involves providing tools, often they're forms of visual scaffolding, material scaffolding, for design teams working on teaching as design activities. And I've picked out some work that's been primarily led by Pippa Yeoman and Lucilla Carvalho over the last 2 or 3 years. They've developed a set of paper cards, not digital ones, and a wireframe representation that functions as a resource for collaborative discussions between university teachers and educational designers who are working on something like development of new curriculum or a revision of a course or creation of a new learning space or renovation of learning spaces. And the cards that they've produced and tested out fall into 4 categories. As you can see here, there's a set of blue cards that represent learning theories and philosophies of learning and that provide resources for a design team to talk about quite high-level concerns to do with assumptions about how students learn or learn best and assumptions about how people should or shouldn't be treated. The yellow cards represent tasks, epistemic design. The green cards represent physical, that is material and digital, resources, set design, and the orange cards represent social design, ideas about grouping learners into pairs or teams or communities. There's a few images here of the ACAD cards in use during a design session. Here you can see a small subset of them being laid out during a design exercise. They're laid out on that ACAD diagram that we looked at earlier on and that you had explained in the video. And here they are laid out on a special grid. We call it the Student Autonomy versus Task Complexity grid, which is particularly useful for teams who are involved in curriculum or learning space redesign. And Lucilla and Pippa have found that it's a really valuable way of stimulating candid conversations about educational aspirations in a design team and their practical enactment in a classroom. So when a team are talking about, for example, redesigning learning spaces to support team-based learning, it raises questions about the extent to which they're prepared to do major curriculum redesign to support greater levels of student autonomy. The last area of our current work that I want to say a few words about is this one. It's to do with making design rationales explicit. with the goal of helping students become better lifelong learners and better at participating in various kinds of design and epistemic activity for themselves and others in the future. And the argument runs roughly like this. Classically, we think of design as being very focused on the creation of new objects, new gadgets or devices, and new products, if you like. But as Klaus Krippendorf said when he was writing about the semantic turn in design back in 2006, design is also communicative. It's about creating things that are passed on to users who then add layers of meaning to what has been created for them and who play a very active role in modifying what has been designed to make it more useful and meaningful to themselves and others over some kind of life cycle of usage. Now, turning that argument on design for learning, we can identify ways in which students complete the designs that have been created for them. They co-configure what's been designed for them. They play an important part in that co-configuration process, to the extent that we might say there's a kind of dual causation that goes on in design for learning, part of which is to do with the inherent efficacy of our designs, but part of which is to do with students understanding our intentions and co-configuring what's been designed in order to better arrive at the outcomes that are intended or some customized version of them. And not only does this allow students to configure environments, and learning tasks and so on to better suit their needs, they also, one can hope, get opportunities for more general and more long-lasting learning. They learn to work with others to configure new epistemic environments, a thing that Lina Markowskite and I talked about quite a bit in our 2017 book. And the area where I'd push that a little bit further is to say that learning to be a more knowledgeable, autonomous designer also equips students as future citizens to play a more active and dynamic role in citizen-based social innovation of the kind that Ezio Mancini and Hilary Cottam have been writing about. And I've talked about this a little in the closing chapter that I wrote for Alison Littlejohn and colleagues in their most recent book on network professional learning, where I was looking at some of these connections between design inquiry, helping students become more conscious of what's going on in learning environment design, and that equipping them for a more active role in social innovation, one way or another. And let me conclude just by saying thank you for your attention. If you want to follow up any more on any of this, you'll find a copy of the slides on my website, and by all means ask questions in the session that follows, or get in contact with me on Twitter or by email. So thanks again.
Wow, thank you, Peter. What a wonderfully stimulating opening for ICCE this year. It's a really wonderful talk. I found that also quite provocative in some ways. We've got a few moments left, and I'm just wondering if we've got any questions that are coming through. If anyone just wants to open up their mic and ask a question, please feel free to do so. While others are thinking about a question, Peter, I have one, and that is that for some decades now, there's been a shift in the literature from talking about instructional design towards learning design, and we often talk about learning designers and educational designers. Back in the early days of the web, I was really influenced by a writer by the name of Etienne Wenger, who famously coined the term communities of practice. And one of the things that Etienne Wenger was famous for was a comment that learning can never be designed. It can only be designed for. This is because learning is based in experience and practice. So I'm just wondering, I think I know what your answer might be, given what you've just talked about with activity in the centre of your model, but I'm just wondering if you have a comment on that.
Yes, thanks for that, John. And I think you're quite right. I agree with Wenger on this, that learning is something that people do, students do, learners do. We give them those labels, whether or not they're learning sometimes. I'm rather against the title learning design and learning designer, because I think it does convey a notion that learning can be designed. I'm much more comfortable with terms like design for learning rather than learning design. But I think I've probably lost that battle. I think it's inscribed in too many people's contracts and too many textbooks and whatever. But I think it does matter. I think if you don't see the difference between A, what you've designed, and B, what students then do, if you can't conceptually distinguish between those two things, then you can't see a lot of the transformative and creative work that goes on when students are actually engaged in learning at what I call learn time. Thank you for that. I saw in the chat that there's a request for the link to the ACAD video. I'm happy to send that. If I send that to you, John, maybe you can share it when it's appropriate. There will be a link to it. There is a link to it on my website. So if you follow that link that I gave at the beginning of this chat session, you'll find it there as well. But I'll send a specific Vimeo link. Okay.
So I think we still have a minute. I might have shortchanged you, Peter, at the start, but we still might have a minute here. Someone's just asked a question now. Given the situated nature of learning and the ubiquity of digital technology in our learning environments, how important do you think is democratization of technology, open hardware and software?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, very good point. And I think there are a number of avenues, if you like, a number of ways to make learning resources and opportunities maximally accessible to people. So if we start looking at issues around open software, open publications and so on, that raises all sorts of complicated questions about markets and how things, what the incentives are to produce things and so on and so forth. I wouldn't want to get into that now, but it seems to me that the more we acknowledge the importance of digital and other resources to people's learning, the more pressure we need to place on whether it's governments or market mechanisms to get rid of barriers that exclude substantial minorities from what's available. I think we can no longer pretend that this is niche activity. If I look back 40 years, it was very much niche activity, one computer per primary school. Now I think we've realized with the current pandemic and the rapid turn to online teaching, we've realized yet again how important digital disadvantage can be to educational opportunities.
Yes, and of course exacerbated by COVID at the moment.
Yes, exactly.
Peter, I think I'm obliged to close this out because of the time. And once again, sorry for cutting you short at the start there. I got my time conversion just a little bit wrong. So we lost a couple of minutes. But anyway, Peter, I really would, I want to thank you once again for a wonderful presentation for ICCE 2020. And we really look forward to, I'm sure many people within the community look forward to connecting with you and communicating further about some of your ideas. And perhaps if you have time, I don't know whether you have time to go and visit the REMO lobby, but perhaps people can meet you there and talk some more. But once again, thank you very much, and we better close this out and let the schedule run its course. Okay.
Well, my pleasure, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So